What if the ethical dilemmas we face with animals, like dogs and dolphins, start applying to AI systems like ChatGPT? Should we care about the welfare of AI in the same way that we care about other intelligent beings? And at what point on the road to artificial general intelligence do we need to pause and ask, are we causing our AI agents harm? In this thought provoking episode, I have the privilege of sitting down with philosopher John Basl to explore his groundbreaking paper, The Ethics of Creating Artificial Consciousness. Together, we'll unravel whether AI might one day deserve moral consideration and what that means for the future of humanity and technology.
But if it turns out rebooting the computer causes them infinite pain and you never even thought to ask that question, you have failed in a minimal obligation you have.
Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy diving deep into questions that challenge the way we think about the world and the technology shaping it. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes on topics such as responsible AI and AI explainability. Your support keeps these conversations alive.
This is the OpenAI Changes Everything podcast with your host, Stephen Walther, where we explore how OpenAI is transforming the future of humanity.
Hey everyone, welcome to the show. I am so excited. I have John Basl here today. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Did I get that right?
You got it, yeah.
I got a nod. Okay, thumbs up. Okay, awesome. And let me start by giving a brief bio. So John is associate professor of philosophy at Northeastern University, whose primary areas of research include moral philosophy and applied ethics, especially the ethics of emerging technologies such as AI and synthetic biology. He teaches courses in moral philosophy, ethics of technology, and ethics in scientific research. And just want to start by saying, thank you for being here. I'm really excited about this interview. I've been thinking about it a lot. I've been arguing with family members about this interview, the whole topic of AI and consciousness. Lots of articles have come up around this recently, especially, like how should we think of the welfare of AI agents and all that stuff. So fascinating area. I can't wait to dive into that. But I did want to ask you a little bit about your background, because you have a unique background. There's not a lot of philosophers walking around anymore in the United States. So I'm curious, how you got interested in philosophy, what kind of, set you down that path. Was there like a professor? Was there a book? Was there a talk you went to? What made you decide that you wanted to be a philosopher?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me, Stephen. I'm really excited to chat with you. In college, I started out as a biology major. I went to Northeastern, where I'm now a professor as an undergrad, and they have a co-op program. That's sort of their crown jewel, where students work for 6 months at a time, several times throughout their educational experience. I did my first co-op in a laboratory, and it sounded like such a cool job. We were cloning bacteria, and really that just means following a recipe. And I became very disillusioned. The people at the head of that lab spent all their time writing grants and thinking not at all about the cool stuff that made me want to do biology. So I started floundering. I sort of messed around for 2 years. I signed up for classes but didn't go. And then I decided I needed to graduate. And I had all the wrong stereotypes about what philosophy was going to be like. I thought it'd be super easy. I could take a few classes, get my degree, and then figure out what I was going to do after. So I stupidly signed up for 4 classes in philosophy, 2 like super high level. And on the first day of moral philosophy, Ron Sandler walks in, one of my colleagues now, my professor at the time. He walks in, no syllabus discussion, rolls up his sleeves and starts with reasons, arguments, justifications, and evidence. And then that semester just destroyed me in the best possible way. We read Rawls, Aristotle, Kant, Mill, and Philosophy of Science. We read Karl Popper and Hempel, Carnap, Goodman, and I was just hooked. And I think because I was a bio major before, I didn't have to take basically any other classes. So I just did philosophy for 2 years straight. And knew that's what I wanted to do, and went to graduate school to do philosophy of biology originally, and with some stuff on ethics, and then it sort of started blending together.
That's awesome. So originally you thought it would be an easy A. Those philosophers, they don't actually do anything. They don't actually build anything. So you went in there, but then you were surprised by sort of, all the stuff that's involved, especially in moral philosophy.
Yeah, the rigor, the difficulty, the puzzles were so hard. Yeah.
Yeah, and you would think like after 2,000 years, they would make more progress in some of these areas, but whatever. But so curious if so is there if there was one book and you're sent off to a desert island and you can only bring one philosopher with you, it can be contemporary, but it can also be, whatever philosopher you want. What would be that one book? What do you think is the sort of like the thing that you'd want if you were stuck for the rest of your life?
I love this question, and my answer is going to be extremely controversial. Charles Darwin, Origin of Species.
Oh, nice. Okay. I
I
like
think
that
he's
answer.
an amazing
Yeah.
philosopher. I think that
Yeah.
book, yeah, I think that book is a philosophy book. I mean, there's lots of
Oh, yeah.
empirical stuff in it, but it's about contrasting the evolutionary theory with a theistic theory. There's lots of like meta science going on. It's also got a bunch of beautiful natural descriptions of the world and great prose, which is not common amongst philosophers.
Yeah, no, but expression of emotions in animal and men. Did I get that title right? But I like, I think that's an amazing book. I think talking about, I mean, he just dives right in there. He talks about mental states and emotions, and he's all for a completely naturalistic theory of morality, which sort of shocking at the time, group selectionism. I love that stuff. Awesome. All right. Well, so the reason I wanted to invite you onto the show is we've had a number of interesting guests who I've been surprised they've, prominent people. We had, for example, the Blums, amazing couple. The Lenore and Manuel Blum, both computer scientists, Carnegie Mellon, Berkeley. I think Manuel Blum won the Turing Award. And they're pushing very hard for this theory of consciousness right now, and where they think that there's a completely sort of computational theory of consciousness. And they, said that they believe that ChatGPT is already showing glimmers of consciousness, which I thought was a little surprising. And I also had Professor Marta Helena on, and Cambridge philosopher, and she's philosophy of mind, and she was also pushing the glimmer. So I was a little surprised. I actually expected, much more pushback on that. And one of the things that raises is all of these issues now that we're talking about like whether AI has creativity and whether AI has consciousness, and that starts to open these questions about like how should we think about AI in terms of, are they like animals? Should we be treating them like, animal consciousness and be concerned about animal welfare in the same way? And that's where I came across your paper. I know it was from a while ago now. I think it was from 2013. One of your papers was on, the title of it was The Ethics of Creating Artificial Consciousness. And that's why I reached out to you, super interested in your work. So let me start actually by asking, I mean, things have changed radically. I mean, since 2013. First off, I'm curious, have your views about like AI and consciousness and ethics changed substantially since you wrote that paper?
That's a good question. I would say most of my views have been refined since that paper came out, a little bit, but largely, well, I've become more skeptical or more pushy about people who are optimistic that we're close to AI consciousness. But my views about what we should do from the moral side if we achieve AI consciousness, or the risks associated with research that pursues that, have largely remained the same.
Okay, so you're skeptical. You have increased skepticism whether we're on. You're not necessarily on Team Sam Altman where you think we're going to have consciousness in 2025. You're more sort of skeptical about sort of the requirements of it, but your views about sort of our moral obligations once we discover that AI is conscious, no matter how far in the future, that hasn't really changed that much. You still have the same kind of views there.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess I do think that if there are going to be people hyping up, if they're doing research that they're hyping up as we're on the verge of artificial consciousness, then they should adopt the kinds of moral principles I defend in that paper and in other papers. Like if you're going to adopt this hype, then then the moral concerns should be real for you. So even though I'm skeptical about the computational theories of consciousness, I think that the evidence we have about there being AI consciousness is misleading and we shouldn't trust it. But for anybody that thinks we're there, whether it's just for hype reasons or they actually had that view, then yeah, I think that they largely owe sort of strong ethics protections for those research projects.
Got it. So I was just reading actually right before I jumped onto the podcast. There was a survey, I guess the University of Waterloo came out with this year, where they surveyed people to see how many people actually believe ChatGPT was conscious right now. And, surprisingly, 2/3 of the people surveyed said, yeah, they believe it's already conscious. So coming back to what you're saying,
What were the demographics for the survey?
It was done by a psychologist, and I'm not sure. I think it was just in the United Kingdom, but I didn't dig into, whether they followed, I don't know, proper statistical techniques or anything, but they did. I think it was just a general public survey to find out that, most people, at least in England, it appears that most people in England now believe ChatGPT is conscious, which is, a little concerning if you do have the moral concerns that you're talking about, that people aren't spending more time worried about it. But so I don't know. I mean,
yeah, that is wild.
Yeah. Well, so I hate doing this to guess, but I'm going to go ahead and quote part of your own paper back to you, because I think it will be a good intro to what we're talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and quote the first line because I thought it captured my attention. But you wrote, "The purpose of this essay is to raise the prospect that engaging in artificial consciousness research that aims to create artifactual entities with conscious states of certain kinds, might be unethical on grounds that wrongs or will very likely wrong the subjects of such research." And I thought, actually, I like the whole introduction to your paper, because instead of focusing on, like rights, or on focusing on, some of the other ways that people have thought about this subject, it seemed like from the very beginning you were treating it more like sort of, almost like, from a welfare perspective. What do we owe, AI, in case we discover that they are, conscious, or they are, what do we owe it right now? How should we think about them as moral beings? And, we've all read science fiction books, even if you don't believe that, AI is like humans enough right now. I mean, unless there's some mysterious weird substance on Earth or whatever, at some point, I think all of us think that we're kind of, at some point we have to start worrying about this stuff. And it seems like from these surveys and from these prominent scientists, we're already at the point where people are kind of thinking about, how we should be treating AI. So it might not be as far off as we originally imagined. So I wanted to start by, I thought it was really interesting that you talk about something called the Dependency Thesis at the beginning of your paper. And I was hoping that you could explain that, because I think that's something that's very important for understanding this stuff. Can you explain what is this Dependency Thesis and why should we care about it?
Sure. So one thing that often happens in debates about sort of, let's say, moral status, like whether we owe certain things to certain kinds of beings, like what's the right way to treat, a baby or an animal or an alien or whatever, is there's this view that the first thing we have to settle is whether we're utilitarians or deontologists or Kantians or virtue theorists or whatever. And then we just figure out what that theory tells us about what we owe to those beings. And I'm pretty skeptical of that for a number of reasons. The dependency thesis is the thesis that what we owe to various beings is dependent upon which normative theory is true. And I think it's wrong. I mean, most simply as a matter of epistemology, we know that infants have equal moral status to us, or we know that they're owed consideration. Their interests are owed consideration. There might be minor details about how do we trade them off against other interests. People typically think infants have very strong interests, like their interests trump ours. But we don't know. I mean, I'm not sure which normative theory is true, and every normative theory agrees on that. And often our views about moral status are the tools we use to help pick apart different versions of moral theories. Like if your version of Kantianism rules out or rules in something as having moral status, then that version of Kantianism is wrong. So I think we know we can make good judgments about which things matter, which kinds of interests matter. Of course, how we take those interests into account does depend on normative theory. Like a Kantian is going to think there are rights associated with having moral status, and a utilitarian is going to think it means weighing and balancing various kinds of interests. But which things interests matter, I think, is epistemically prior to the normative theory question.
Got it. And that simplifies a lot of the stuff that we have to talk about, because otherwise, if you had to figure out the true moral theory before you can even start addressing questions about, like, animal rights or AI rights, or how we want to think about these beings, then, we'll never get anywhere, because again, we've been arguing about this for thousands of years. And so we have our alien, AI babies showing up at some point. So we should probably figure out, how we want to treat them. So it sounds like you're saying that, look, we already have, we haven't, your argument for sort of, against the dependency thesis is, we already have pretty widespread agreement about, most adults, humans, babies. A lot of us agree about animals, but, for huge groups of entities, we already have a lot of agreement on what we want to treat as moral beings. And so getting into a discussion of like the particulars of a certain theory isn't actually, necessary, because we've already demonstrated that we don't need that.
Yeah, even if there's not agreement per se, like, things are controversial, people disagree, but we have arguments that don't depend on moral theory. So like the most famous arguments about moral status come from Peter Singer in his All Animals Are Equal. Nowhere in there does he endorse utilitarianism in his defense of the moral equality of non-human animals and humans. He never mentions, in fact, he drops the word rights in there, which is very weird for a utilitarian, but his argument is just totally, everybody reads it as a utilitarian thesis because he's a utilitarian. And the rest of the book is him doing utilitarianism as applied to moral equality. But that key chapter on moral status, no mention of utilitarianism or normative theory in any way. So we have good arguments that beings with conscious interests deserve consideration of their interests.
Interesting. So I wanted to talk, by the way, just out of curiosity, have you been to petersinger.ai and argued with AI Peter Singer?
I have not. I am unsurprised that it exists. But.
No, I found out he did a interview with the New York Times, and I was surprised. He's a big AI fan, and so they actually built an AI version of Peter Singer. And you go to petersinger.ai and you can argue about animal rights and all this stuff with him directly. And in the New York Times interview, he was talking about how he's kind of getting up there in age, but this gives him a way to keep arguing forever. He can always be ran on a server and making his arguments, which I can say, I don't know.
Bentham, they roll out Bentham's body, but now we can just bust out Singer's AI.
There you go. Anyway, so I was curious about, because it did, you mentioned Peter Singer a few times in the article. I think in the footnotes you discuss him a little bit, and it felt like very much that you were making a similar argument about sort of AI welfare as he's made about like animal welfare. And I wanted to ensure that I was understanding you correctly. It sounds like for you, the most important question is whether or not, a creature, AI, machine, space alien, whatever, has interests. And if those interests are, sort of like, prevented, or if we're blocking them in some way or causing some sort of suffering, then that's sort of the critical issue for you, the way that you think about what a moral being is, something that can have sort of welfare, or I think you use the phrase, moral patient, that's sort of the defining characteristic. Am I getting that right?
Putting on just my super annoying philosopher's hat, it's super close. So like the thing is, maybe the refinement since that paper is, I think there's lots of kinds of interests. So I believe in biological interests, but I just don't think all interests matter from the moral point of view. So there, in another paper in my book, I sort of explain, unlike Peter Singer, who thinks like the only interests are tied to mental states, I believe things can be good or bad for plants. I just think from the moral perspective, we don't have to care about those interests. So they're welfare interests, but controversially, not all welfare interests matter. So the ones that matter are, as you say, it's the ones tied to certain positive and negative mental states. The frustration of those are the ones that moral agents have to be responsive to.
Okay. No, that's an important clarification, because I think it brings us to the next point about, you could conceive of things having interest without being conscious at all. And you even bring up, I thought was really intriguing. You brought up like things can even be conscious without us having any sort of like moral obligations. I think you give the example of some sort of creature that is conscious of the color blue, but maybe doesn't have any pain or suffering or anything else. It's not really clear that we would have any sort of, moral obligations to that creature in that case. I thought that was an interesting argument. So
Yep.
if I'm understanding you correctly, it's
Thanks.
really suffering. It's certain some sort of valence, positive or negative states, mental states, and they have to be conscious. I'm assuming in sort of the hard conscious
Yeah,
way, experiential conscious. Yes, sorry. Go ahead.
no, that's exactly right. I'm not committed to like hedonism versus preference satisfaction views, but some kind of minimal state is consciousness, but then you have to have some valence attached to it, whether it's the satisfaction of a preference, which is just for listeners, there's an important difference between sort of me enjoying an experience and me satisfying a preference. Like a preference is a way that I want the world to be. And I could be experiencing a way the world is that's not actual. Like I dream that I'm eating ice cream. My preference for ice cream is not actually satisfied, but I'm enjoying the experience. And so those are different. And I don't want to take a stance on whether the satisfaction view is correct or the enjoyment view is correct, but one of something in that domain is a requirement of having the relevant kind of interests that matter from the moral point of view.
Got it. Okay.
In the
Yeah, that makes
consciousness
sense.
case, I don't
Yeah.
even think that's an interest. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And so, okay. And I liked your example of the neural chimera research, which actually, honestly, I didn't know if that was actual research or not when I read the article, but it sounded somewhat plausible. I could kind of believe it. But can you walk us through that? Because I think it's a really powerful argument. I think it makes it very concrete, sort of the way that you're thinking about AI and consciousness.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you like that argument. It is things in that domain are real research, and that's where I actually started working on these issues of research ethics and moral status enhancement. So a chimera is just an organism that's composed of DNA of two species. And some of the research is on what are called neural chimeras, taking, for example, human embryonic or human brain cells and implanting them in the brains of, say, a mouse. So a human animal neural chimera would be one that has human cells and mouse cells or another animal cells, in particular neural cells. And the worry I was raising there was like, look, we know we have pretty good standards. Well, I mean, these are minimal standards for doing animal subjects research, which is that we should minimize the suffering of animal consistent with legitimate research aims. So if you can do mouse research, but give them adequate food and housing, and like some animals like guinea pigs need social housing is important for them. If it doesn't cost you seriously in achieving legitimate research ends to provide those things, then you have an obligation to do so. So that's what you owe to animal research subjects minimally. But when you start messing with the cognitive capacities of organisms, you change the ways they can suffer, right? So if all of a sudden I have much longer memory, now I can suffer from and also benefit from past memories. But if you don't know that you've given me that capacity, then you might be causing me suffering that you don't know about. And it's important for us to understand our research subjects. So if we're not even thinking about the ways that we might be changing the capacities of animals, then we're not appropriately responsive to their interests. And so the AI case, I think, is analogous. If you're trying to create an AI consciousness and you think there's some chance that's going to have preferences or attitudes or the capacity for enjoyment, but you don't have a way or aren't even actively trying to figure that out so you can make sure you're satisfying their minimum. Maybe the research is fine if you're doing the things that are okay for them. But if it turns out rebooting the computer causes them infinite pain and you never even thought to ask that question, you have failed in a minimal obligation you have.
See, this is what's so challenging about all this for me. I mean, we don't have a good grasp of consciousness, and then you're bringing in, completely alien sort of ways of thinking. I mean, I don't know, like, my favorite example, C. elegans. What is it? It has like around 300 neurons, extremely simple creature, the little round worm. It does have desires. It likes to, apparently it really loves the smell of popcorn. So we'll go, running after popcorn. And, it has predators. So it gets frightened, or at least it acts in a way in response to things. And so I'm always, yeah, well, maybe. And there's the question, right? I mean, am I
Yeah.
anthropomorphizing C. elegans here in the same way that, apparently everyone in England is doing with ChatGPT? Or are these like legitimate ways of referring to, the action? I mean, it's biologically, C. elegans is biologically the same as we are, just, vastly less complex. It has some of the, very beginnings of, sort of like suffering and pleasure and all that. But again, we're talking so simple here. So I guess I just find it super challenging to, especially when we're talking about creatures who are either, much simpler than we are, or maybe just different. I mean, maybe they have very different
Very
emotions and they
different.
have
Yeah.
different, and it's hard to, since we don't really have this consciousness detector that we can go and test things, and we don't really have a good grasp of mental states. Where does that leave us? I mean, it feels like we're kind of in a position where, I mean, I don't know what. So I'm curious. C. elegans seems to be, maybe it's something that we should be concerned about as welfare. The thermostat in my house, I'm absolutely sure I'm not going to care what the thermostat cares about, because I mean, even though the thermostat is responsible for regulating the temperature of my house and it has objectives, and I'm pretty sure that thing's not conscious, and so I'm not going to worry about. But how do we like figure that out? I mean, it seems like there's a very practical reason to start worrying about this stuff now, because we actually, not only in the case of animals, but also in case of all this AI stuff that's going on.
Yeah, I mean, moral philosophy is hard, and Phil mind is like 5 times harder. It's so, and the epistemology of mind is so hard. I guess I'll have a few things to say. One, like, I do think drawing the distinction between sort of goal grounded interests and then consciousness grounded interest is super important. Like, I think that all sorts of things have like goal oriented or goal grounded interests, like the thermostat. I don't think you should think it's conscious. The problem is the epistemology gets so hard for two reasons. One, you can go one of two directions. You can either go bottom up or top down. So top down, you start with, hey, I know this thing is conscious, and then I look for evidence that it's like me. So I'm like pretty certain you're conscious. And my evidence for that comes from three sources. Behaviorally, you act like you're conscious.
Yeah.
Physiologically, I mean, I didn't verify this, but inside, the same kind of stuff going on. And then the most important piece that makes those pieces of evidence is our evolutionary relatedness. It'd be weird for us to be so closely evolutionarily related, have the same physiology, have the same behaviors, but not have the same properties internally. So then we can use that to move down the tree of life. Like mammals evolved, they're pretty close to us. They're physiologically pretty similar to us, and they behave in certain kinds of ways. And so our evidence for their consciousness when they have physiologies like ours is pretty strong. You get to birds, it gets less so because their physiology changes. You get further down the tree where things are like branched off of like our most recent common ancestor to them is like plants or bacteria, and they're genuinely alien to us. Like we're not sure if so like cephalopods are a really hard case because they're very behaviorally complex. Physiologically, they are aliens. Evolutionarily, they are so far on the other side of the tree life. And the AI problem is on this approach just intractable because physiologically, not like us, not even on the tree of life. And then behaviorally, they are programmed to give off the consciousness behavior. So that's not evidence. Right. So it's like even when they're really robust behaviorally, they've been trained to be robust behaviorally. So it screens off the evidential value of the behavior. So the other option is to figure out what is consciousness, like start at the other end.
Right.
And that's where you get the hard problem of consciousness. We just don't have a great theory. And so there's no just deriving what consciousness is from the base properties or anything like that. I mean, Eric Schwitzgebel is one of my favorite philosophers on this. And he's just like, all the views are terrible. So just pick whichever one you like. I mean, he's not quite that glib, but there's like panpsych is a mirage because like we can't figure out how to explain consciousness. So we just start saying everything's conscious.
Yeah. So it sounds like what you're saying is it's almost like animals are the easy case because they came from the same evolutionary tree. And I remember like Marta Helena was talking about like certain stages of evolution, and maybe there's even, special things that have to happen. And that's great. And so we have a common history. But it sounds like you're saying that, AI is more like if a space alien showed up, they have no common history with us at all. we don't, so we can't do those comparisons. And as you point out, AI is even worse because it's been trained to fake us out that it's conscious. So, it can just be doing an incredible, job. Of course, as every human could be faking you out too, but at least as you point out, there's the common ancestry. Well, so let's get really
Yep.
concrete. So you've already expressed some skepticism about ChatGPT. Curious, is ChatGPT, do you think, I guess there's two questions here, and one of them you address in the article, but let me just ask, do you think ChatGPT as it currently exists is showing glimmers of consciousness? Do you think like maybe ChatGPT 12, if we, a few years from now, are we looking at, a possible future version, maybe version 99? I don't know. But at some point, or is it just, do you think that that's not something that, and, getting back to the general thing, given that we don't have a good consciousness detector, how are we going to figure all this stuff out?
Yeah, I guess I don't think there's any more evidence that it's conscious than any of our best chess playing models or any other models we have for other tasks. Like nobody has really convinced me that the capacities that it exhibits require consciousness, that you couldn't achieve that computationally without consciousness. So given the absence of some argument like that, I'm extremely skeptical. Given what I mean, I've tried to learn as much as I can about how Gen AI works, about large language models, about attention headers, about like all these tools, and nothing in that description makes me think that we're doing anything like non-standard. Of course, like I don't know what's going on in our brains that's non-standard either. That's part
Right.
of the problem. Um, and I think there is a kind of tendency, especially among philosophers, to sort of have this view about we should be substrate agnostic. We shouldn't think there's anything special about biological brains that makes them conscious. But I think there's plenty of good philosophers of mind that aren't like theists or anything that are like, we're not in a good position to think that either. Like
Right.
maybe there is something about, like there's all sorts of cases where a certain kind of substrate is necessary to get some emergent property. Like you can't get bread without yeast. So but we don't even know enough about the substrate. So I just feel so confounded, but I do think this is true. You have just as much reason to think ChatGPT is conscious as Windows. I guess is like a slightly glib way to put it.
Interesting. But I mean, but that does also raise the question of like, I don't know, there was a big announcement, I guess it was yesterday, about the new quantum chip that Google came out with. It uses a completely new technology. They're claiming it works across possible worlds. And, which is kind of crazy. But we don't, I mean, maybe the biological substrate isn't the only substrate where you can get consciousness. Maybe that was, now that they have this new quantum chip, we don't know how consciousness is working. So maybe that thing is magically conscious. I don't know. And then, I mean,
Maybe.
the other thing that I'm feeling is, familiar with Daniel Dennett. I know all this sort of skepticism about, well, maybe the answer to the hard problem of consciousness is it's just not a coherent position. There's no such thing as experiential consciousness, and we should just throw that away. And, I'm kind of getting more and more sympathetic because you point out there's nothing in the transformer model. There's no like little box in the diagram in the transformer model where they say consciousness required here to be able to do these calculations. You're never going to get that in any sort of like, system diagram. And I have to wonder if the same thing is true for humans, that once we map out the human brain, there's not going to be like a magical box where we say, oh, well, we have to have consciousness there, or the rest of the stuff's not going to happen. And there are, I know, I think his name's Frankish. I know there's other people who are like very skeptical. There's the illusionist theory of consciousness, where people are very
Yeah.
skeptical about whether this sort of hard version of consciousness would even make sense. But I feel kind of conflicted about it, because I feel like, I want to be a good person. I want to be a moral person. And if we're like treating AI badly, it feels like we should figure that out. But on the other hand, if we don't really have a good grasp of consciousness, then maybe, there's not, I can't, it sort of puts me in a position where I don't have enough data to make, good decisions about if I'm actually causing harm or not, or if I'm acting moral. So I'm like stuck in a position where I'm not quite
Yeah.
sure what to do.
Well, I'm in that position all the time, but so I empathize. Yeah, I guess I'll just add to that. There are lots of views you can take on consciousness. I don't know that consciousness is a totally intractable problem. At least figuring out like what are the core components of consciousness for things we know are conscious. There are consciousness researchers who try to figure out like what capacities have to be integrated to give rise to consciousness, and maybe that'll be illuminating for species. Like maybe it'll help explain in beings we know are conscious, like what features are necessary for getting it. Whether that's extendable to other kinds of beings, I think that remains to be seen. But I mean, that's why they call it the hard problem of consciousness. Like I have troubles with illusionism. Like I don't know. Like I can't endorse a view that basically says like what is an illusion if it's not a feature of consciousness? Like the very idea that like, oh, consciousness is an illusion, it presupposes a concept that I already take for granted that is consciousness. So every time someone tries to talk to me about eliminativism or illusionism, I just go, I can't even understand the position, but I see that it answers a bunch of questions. Like it helps solve these things. But let me just say on the moral side, like if the problem of consciousness is deeply, deeply intractable, like we'll never be able to tell, I think that gives us a genuine moral excuse. Like it's possible that trees suffer when we cut them down. But if we can't possibly figure that out, how could we be blamed? Because for all we know, what they love is getting chopped down. So I think the most morally ambiguous cases are cases where people are trying to create a computational equivalent of a human mind. Like when people want to simulate human minds in AI systems, that's where you have the most reason to think, well, if that's what you're trying to simulate, then it's going to have interests much like ours. And that is a tractable problem.
Right. Right. And I guess that's where we're, sort of moving toward with OpenAI and with autonomous agents and with, longer chain reasoning and all the stuff that they're building into it now. I mean, there's no question in they're building a lot of stuff into ChatGPT, so it seems more human. The whole, audio chat and emotional responses and Scarlett Johansson showing up. I mean, those are all ways to make it seem more human. So they obviously have an interest in moving that direction, and we all have an interest in, getting our AI assistants that are close to human as possible. So, I mean, right, but I it makes me kind of feel, I don't know, queasy, this argument that you just made about trees, not knowing whether or not, because it's sort of like, well, we don't
Oh,
know,
no.
so we can't be held morally responsible. And I mean, I'm not, that's not going to stop me from chopping down trees, but it still makes me feel kind of uncomfortable. I mean, I guess I just worry that we'll never, as you point out, that we'll never really have a consciousness test. But we'll get to a point gradually where more and more people, like in England, think of AI as conscious, and then they'll start thinking about, sort of welfare. And it gets us into really weird territory, though, because, one of the things about like AI is first, how do we even individuate that? Is there one ChatGPT? Is it a lot of different programs? I don't even know how to think about that. But there's also the whole question of like, I mean, in the way that you're thinking about sort of like moral beings, what does it mean for an AI to have an interest? I mean, especially when we program them to have specific interests, and we're capable of spinning up a new AI in seconds and then eliminating it. What is that? I mean, this is kind of like a crazy form of factory farming for little intelligences, and it gets very weird very quickly because now we're working with a very different type of intelligence that we're spinning up. And if we do think that at some point, there will be conscious emotions, that at some point ChatGPT could feel pain, maybe not now, but at some point, in the distant future, and we won't really have a good way of detecting that. And we won't really be, and we have so much control over the interests. I don't know. It just gets us into a really weird situation very quickly where either I'm afraid it will devalue sort of like the way we think of humans and animals because we're so used to spinning up AI so quickly, or we'll be in a position where we're very reluctant to, use AI because we're not quite sure, anymore. We've invented a new form of slavery with our AI, which would be, really unfortunate, right? Because if we're now creating, spinning up these creatures to do our bidding, that seems wrong. We should figure that out. So I don't know. I mean,
yeah. Eric Schwitzgebel's got this principle of excluded middle, which is like, you should not create things of ambiguous moral status because doing so, you're very likely, or you have the potential to act wrong. If you treat them as if they have moral status and they don't, you're giving up significant benefits. And if you treat them as if they don't have moral status and they do, then you're just enslaving them or treating them very poorly. And so I'm somewhat sympathetic to that. I just happen to think we're not anywhere near that middle ground. But if for anybody that's convinced these things are conscious, they should be advocating for their just not using them, not developing them, not deploying them.
So I have to ask, do you think there's lots of people who've talked about like shutting down OpenAI. There's been all those, public letters to pause research on large language models. I've talked to several of those people, and but it's typically not for this reason. It's more like the extinction of humanity reason, which is also a pretty good reason to be concerned about shutting this stuff down. But do you think this is another reason to sort of like to pause research, or at least to be more thoughtful about how we're sort of charging forward? We're in the middle of Shipmas right now. There's a new announcement from OpenAI every day where they're showing off new, abilities. We get 12 new, abilities. This stuff is moving so incredibly fast, and all these models are moving fast. Do you think that in and of itself is dangerous? Do you think we should start like, I don't know, having more sort of government regulation and government control? I know we have an AI Safety Institute in the United States. We're trying to do some stuff, but I don't know. At the same time, we also don't want to pause all this development going on.
Yeah, it's a big question. I think there's a lot of questions in there. I think there are lots of reasons why we might not be much more cautious about what OpenAI is doing, and none of them are tied to either consciousness research or AI risk. I think there's just everyday issues, the way that it integrates with society, its impact on employment, on economics, on every discipline. Like there's all sorts of ethical, the tech is moving way faster than the ethics. And in some ways, I worry that their attention to issues of consciousness and AI risk just is a tool to detract from consideration of these everyday. They're not mundane because they impact so many people. And I think that's where a lot of the ethical labor is. And I think that's the grounds for having much stricter regulation. But we're not currently, I give a whole talk on like where we are in the AI ethics space, and we're not doing great. And you mentioned the AI Safety Institute. That's the thing we have for now. It's grounded in a Biden executive order that the new administration has already said they're going to detract. So whether we have an AI Safety Institute come January is another question. So I think there are very good reasons for a much more thoughtful approach to what these large companies are doing with these models. Do I think that there's some grounded in this
Sorry, there's a little bit of delay there. But so just to echo back what you're saying, there's also this huge, which, is a thing that keeps coming up in this podcast, is how many jobs are being impacted. All the software engineer jobs gone. AI can, generate software. I'm using Cursor right now to generate code, and it's amazing. Just hit tab a bunch of times and you get your entire application done. It's impacting paralegals, it's impacting education, and those are definitely going to displace everyone. I find it a little odd. Sam Altman sort of, focus on UBIs too. It's all going to be okay. We'll all have a UBI up there, and then we'll make up for it. But those are legitimate concerns. Just the profound sort of like changes that we'll have to go through, where all these familiar jobs are going away.
And the environmental costs. There's so many considerations about, but on the consciousness side, I don't know. I'm not inside OpenAI. I'm not inside DeepMind. Like if they're literally trying to create a neural replica of a human brain in a computational system and throw a ton of compute at it, then there should be an oversight committee looking at that. Because if anything is going to convince, if I think that anything is going to replicate consciousness in a computer system, it's simulating neuron for neuron a thing we already know is conscious. Am I certain that'll work? No, but that's the kind of thing where we should be thinking about regulation and oversight. I doubt there's very much of it in there. But yeah, so I think there's all sorts of reasons to be much more careful about what all these companies are doing, both for near-term stuff and also a little bit for the far-term stuff.
Wow. Well, this conversation has been super interesting. Thank you. Are there suggestions for, like, if people want to dive into more of this, if they want to follow the work that you're doing, if they want to sort of learn more about this, what do you recommend people? Is there, books you would recommend, websites? What's the best way for people to sort of stay up on this stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, unfortunately, the pop literature for AI ethics is pretty sparse. Like philosophers are pretty bad at talking to the public in general. That's why they don't let us do it very much. But I think that, Shannon Valor's got a book out. Yeah, thanks. Shannon Valor's got a book called The AI Mirror that I think is pretty good. She's very good at talking to a broader audience. Helen Nissenbaum is like the OG tech ethicist, and I really recommend people look into her work. It's mostly about privacy stuff and not this stuff. I think the future is really bright. There's so many junior scholars in this area who are not yet writing public-oriented work, but when we get there, they're incredible. Some of my colleagues, some of the other people in the field that I know. But I really think in this case, the most important thing people do, like what the people of the UK should do, is actually need to learn more about the technology. Because really what's key is understanding the technical tools so you can bring your value analysis to those tools in a responsible way. If you misunderstand the tech, it's very hard to understand how they relate to how your values relate to technology, how to advocate for your values in the face of that technology. There's a recent book called AI Snake Oil by Narayanan and Kapoor that I think does a good job of making the technology accessible. And then there's plenty of books you can read on moral philosophy that can help shape how you should think about the technology. But I think a lot of us, philosophers especially, just don't have the technology in our heads, and that leads to us theorizing pretty badly about it. So I'd really recommend that people find explainers on how these tools work, which are also sometimes hard to come by.
Well, thank you for your time today. I appreciate it. Good meeting you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for the OpenAI Changes Everything podcast, where we explore how OpenAI is transforming the future of humanity. Please remember to subscribe to ensure that you receive future episodes.